Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to say a few words, but first, most importantly, we have Professor Michael Hoare, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, to open the forum today.
A very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. There are not so many of us, so just an invitation here for those of you who are sitting behind, if you would care to come forward slightly, right? Entirely voluntary, just a suggestion that you come forward, because I think for the speakers, it's very difficult to to speak to a scattering of people like that. So if you are not averse to it, if you could come forward a little bit, the people at the back, Can you please,
Please come forward.
Thank you. In brief, that's what I meant, Yeah, please take a seat. Come all the way up. Come all the way forward.
We don't actually bite.
They do other things, but I shall leave that to Stephen to elaborate. Come, please. I'll just wait a few seconds for the people who have just come in. Please come forward. Please come forward. Okay, much better. Thank you. If you don't mind, if you don't mind, just come forward. Okay, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure for me to open an event like this. Unfortunately, in my position now, I seem to be opening more events than attending them. But it's a great pleasure today to welcome I think you are the who's who of LGBT and generally human rights work in Hong Kong. LGBT rights itself. I think. There's a difference between the LGBT kind of activism and the sort of race, women's rights. I think race and women's rights. I think there is a general agreement. That something is wrong, and let's do something about it. Of course, there's still many battles about how and what. In the area of the LGBT activism, I think this is still being hotly contested, at least by a significant majority of people around the world, who don't think that there should be such a thing as LGBT rights, at all. We've seen the sort of backlash in the US, where certain pro-LGBT measures have been rolled back by the new administration, and I think we can expect this to happen around the world, So there'll be a ding-donging, So I appreciate the fact that many of the people here are the sort who will stick around, Take and accept the losses and move on, fight another day to win. So let me congratulate all of you here who are in that kind of work. But within the LGBT kind of activism, the T is again a kind of a stepsister, or stepbrother of LGBT rights. In fact, it's not that long ago that people seldom even spoke about transgenderism. So here we are at in a sense, the forefront of what I call anti-discrimination work, broadly. I see a very interesting program, and of course, very interesting people who are going to speak to you. They are people from everywhere. The people who study scholastically, the people who practice it in town, the people who provide the numbers and statistics, and the people who agitate in public, and of course, the people in government, who actually have to end up writing the rules. So let me wish all of you a very fruitful day, and I hope, as I think you do too, that not too long from now, we will have appropriate transgender legislation, so that whether you are transgender or not, you will have the same rights and the same status as anyone else. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. And let me join Professor Hoare in welcoming all of you, and thank you very much for coming out on a rainy morning and very early on a Saturday morning. I never learned my lesson about organizing conferences too early on Saturday mornings, and I've done it again. But thank you very much for coming. I'm Kelley Loper. I'm the director of the Center for Comparative and Public Law in the Faculty of Law here at Hong Kong U. We decided to organize this event shortly after the Interdepartmental Working Group on Gender Recognition published its consultation paper and called for submissions in June. As you may know, the working group was established after the landmark Court of Final Appeal decision in the case of W and Registrar of Marriages, also known informally, I think, as Hong Kong's transgender marriage case. I'm looking at Michael Vidler now to get approval for that name, or nomiker. But we want to build, the center wants to build on the previous work that we've done on these issues over the last several years, and hopefully contribute something to the consultation process, and eventually, hopefully, have an impact on the law reform process as well. We will be drafting a report based on the discussion today, which will be published on our website, and we'll also be making a submission to the working group ourselves. And I would also encourage all of you to consider participating and making submissions as part of the consultation exercise. Last week, I had a chance to read something that put the issue of gender recognition in perspective for me. It was an excellent draft book chapter, an academic book chapter, written by one of my collaborators on a related project, Professor Ho-Ning Lau, who some of you know, from the University of North Carolina. And the chapter is called Gender Recognition as a Human Right. Now, the title is short and sweet, unlike titles of many academic publications, but I think particularly apt. And his legal analysis clarifies that international human rights law is relevant and requires states in governments, including the Hong Kong government, to ensure the rights of transgender people through gender recognition and non-discrimination legislation and any other measures that are necessary. And Professor Lau points out that this is true even though the terms gender recognition, gender identity, transgender are not explicitly mentioned in any of the core international human rights treaties. In other words, what we're talking about are basic human rights. And I know some of the panelists will be discussing the legal implications in a lot greater detail, but I just wanted to set the stage with this at this point. At its core, the issues under discussion today are really about the rights of everyone in our society to go about their daily lives, to be free from discrimination, to be themselves, achieve their full potential. In other words, it's really about the ability for all of us to live in dignity. And I can't think of any other person better to speak to this topic than our keynote speaker today. And it's become very common at conferences to introduce prominent speakers by saying the person needs no introduction. And at the risk of sounding a bit cliche, I'm going to do just that. In Stephen Whittle's case, and in this context, it's absolutely true. He really needs no introduction. So I'll just say that Professor Whittle was the driving force behind the movement for and the introduction of gender recognition legislation in the UK. He continues to be an agent of positive change in this area around the world. In my limited experience watching and listening to him speak in person, it seems to me that a major reason for his success is his ability to connect with others. Last night, he kindly came to my class and shared his experiences and knowledge with my human rights students. And I'm pretty sure that everyone in the classroom, and many of them have come back for more, but everyone in the classroom was both moved and inspired by what he had to say. He had an amazing way of connecting with us that made the issues very real and reminded us of the power of personal interaction and the importance of loving relationships. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Stephen Whittle back to Hong Kong and to Hong Kong U.
Right. Well done. Thank you. Is this on? I'm never sure whether anybody could ever hear me. Can you all hear me? Good. It's 25 years that I have been coming to Hong Kong, initially to teach on the equivalent of an evening class with an arrangement with my home university. And it's 25 years ago that I first went on the early version of the internet and wrote a message saying, are there any transsexual or transgender people in Hong Kong who would like to meet? That first time I came, I met one person. The last time I came 3 years ago, I went to the Transgender Support Centre and there were just masses of people there. And to me, that is a really important signifier to the changes that have taken place, not just in Hong Kong, but worldwide. So this morning, I'm going to talk about the Interdepartmental Working Group report, and I'm really talking to the people who are going to have to write the consultation responses to that. Because I think there are clear clues in the report as to where you need to go, where you need to put your evidence together, and, you know, the questions that you need to answer. Now, for those who were at the class last night or at the EOC yesterday, the slides are the same, but I'm going to try and talk about them in a slightly different way today, through the notion of what needs to be done in this current consultation. The report is really very clear in its central premise. First of all, it gives you a complete history of transgender law, the most complete you could ever possibly need. It's easy to read, it tells it well, nobody needs to be frightened of reading the report. But then it comes with 5 good arguments as to why there should be a gender identity law here in Hong Kong, and I'm not going to go through them in any depth because they are sound legal arguments that are made in the report. First of all, the idea that, you know, maybe gender isn't quite as binary as we've always thought about it. That actually the need to eliminate discrimination is important for every member of a society. That perhaps it is a basic human right to be recognised as the person you are and not the person who other people think you ought to be. That actually we're moving forward with an international trend. 47 countries, well, far more than that actually, provide a mechanism for gender recognition nowadays, but 47 of them have a no surgical requirement, no sterilisation requirement. And it's only, when was it? 1996, I went to a conference of the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And at that time, I was new on the scene, just got my PhD, and nobody actually knew me, and they didn't realise I was trans. So I was invited to sit down at a lunch table with some senior doctors and a professor from, I won't give his name, a professor from a university in Switzerland who was seen as the big expert on this area. And there was a conversation about the fact that sterilisation was a SED. It was a natural, absolute need that if you were going to provide any form of system of providing trans people with new birth certificates or new identity cards, they must be sterilised because you couldn't possibly have people like them having babies. But the very fact that we are human beings, and most human beings actually grow up with a desire to make family, to then remove that fundamentally from people without real justification other than what it might look like is, you know, I sat there listening to this and finally I said, I think I disagree. And I explained that my wife and I had 4 children. And then they tried to stop me speaking at the conference, and then there was a huge big public battle, and it was embarrassing on my part, but I won. I got to say my paper, because I actually pointed out that I had left my wife with 4 children under the age of 6, including twin babies, to come and give that paper, and so I was going to do it. But that notion of the idea that you somehow weren't as entitled to participate in the notion of family as other people, to me, in the early days, was so crucial to a failure of the system to recognise that we were as human as anybody else. So that's my little bit of rant there in the middle. And the final argument is they say, well, you know, if we do this, it ensures legal certainty. We'll know exactly what the law is. We won't have any of this faffing around where people have to go off and, you know, well, if you have this sort of surgery, we might let you change your passport and your driving licence, but it all depends, well, it depends whether you're a trans woman or a trans man, because we recognise there's certain differences. Well, if you just remove all that and say, you know, okay, we'll find a mechanism whereby we're not putting those onerous tasks on you, it will ensure legal certainty for all. What's more interesting in the report is the against arguments, and they give you it nicely laid out, 5 against arguments. And what's really important is this report actually asks you, that's whether you're an academic or an activist or just an ordinary member of Hong Kong society, to give your views on these 5 arguments, whether you think we should agree with them or there is a counter to them. Now, obviously, I'm here as a trans man and as an activist, and I believe the right thing to do is to say these arguments are fundamentally flawed. So what I'm going to do today is quickly go through sort of, I suppose, the quick argument, the quick versions of the arguments back, the things that you need to go off and do the homework and the reading about, to put it in a Hong Kong framework and to write those letters. Now, I can't tell you how important this is. Many years ago, when we were doing the Gender Recognition Act, I got a phone call to go down to London and see the minister responsible for the Act. And this was, you know, a big calling. I had never actually met the minister before at that point. Got my best suit out, you know. I think I even bought a new shirt, especially for the occasion. Went down to London and got introduced. He said, "Follow me." We walked down a corridor, and then he opened a door to a sort of storage cupboard, and there were boxes piled high. And he said, there are 185,000 signatures as to why we shouldn't have a Gender Recognition Act. What do I say to that? Now, at the time, I said, how many people have actually written to say you should have a Gender Recognition Act? And he said, well, just over 2,000. I said, well, you see these 185,000? I know how they were done. They were done in churches. People were offered a free bowl of soup and some nice bread, and they were given a postcard to sign. But guess what? Not one of them is ever going to want to change their legal gender. Of the 2,100, I'm sure there are some employers, there are some family members, but a significant number of them will be people who are actually changing their gender. In other words, they have a say on this matter, and the 185,000, in my view, have very little say. And he said, thank you, that was the argument I needed. Sent me off. It took less than 5 minutes. But he walked into the House of Lords about 3 months later and said precisely that. I give no heed to the boxes of the 185,000 postcards from people for whom this has no reality and no meaning. Now, the other thing I think that's really important about consultations is to get people to respond to them. When I remember doing some research, when I was a research assistant, years and years and years ago, doing some stuff on responses to government consultations, and the average response rate from ordinary people was 28 at that time. That was in the UK, a country of 66 million people. Proportionally, going to Hong Kong, it must be about 3, in other words. We now average just over 100 ordinary people responding to government consultations. The stuff that we have done on LGBTI issues has always had thousands, because of the activism work that has done, that has given the community ways of writing. And one of the key things was doing the homework ourselves, finding the answers to the questions, and then helping the community to write those for themselves. We didn't produce printed sheets of paper, though, or postcards, meet at lunch and sign. We said, these are the arguments, now put it in your own life. Write about what it would mean to you. Make somebody realise that you are a human being and that you're real, and you will get your voice heard. So, I'm a great believer in responding to consultation. So let's look at these against arguments. I've reflected on these arguments, looking at what the science actually says, what has been the experience of other states, because we've just been, at this moment in time, we're going through a new consultation in the UK on proposals, a private consultation or a small consultation on proposals to update our gender recognition legislation. So we've been collecting evidence. I mean, I'm still getting replies late last night, and I hope to bring those in. The social changes that have taken place, and some of the other aspects of change that have also, surprised some of us at times. And I'm going to look at it in the light of some of the national work that data we've been collecting. So let's just look at the UK. Now, when the UK did the Gender Recognition Act, it was state of the art. It was the first time we'd had embodied legislation which said people could have a legal change of gender, but they didn't have to go and have any form of surgical treatment to have that. No requirements for sterilisation, no genital reconstruction surgery, nothing. What you had to do was prove that for 2 years you'd lived in your new gender role, and you had to have gone and seen a doctor and had a diagnosis that this was real for you. Since then, 4,500 people, well over that, have obtained legal gender recognition. There have been 78 rejections in that time, but most have then later gone on to get their gender recognition certificate. The rejections have generally been about things like paperwork not being accurately filled out, or the other thing, we saw people using the wrong forms, things like that. But most of them have gone on since to get their gender recognition certificates. Ireland has done this much more recently. Only 3 years ago, Ireland decided to have gender recognition legislation and same-sex marriage, all virtually in one go, in an entirely Roman Catholic country where everybody went to school with nuns, and to have, the referendum on same-sex marriage was gobsmacking almost, and that's the best word I can use for it. To get a whole nation of people voting for same-sex marriage in a referendum with a massive vote for was really key to also pushing through the gender recognition legislation. Now, Ireland has gone for what you might call on-demand system. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to have seen a doctor at all. You don't have to demonstrate that you're getting paid in your new gender role or anything. All you do is you go off to a registry office, fill in a form, pay a small fee, and if you're over the age of 16, you know, a couple of weeks later, you've got a new birth certificate. Simple as that. They have rejected one person in the time that they've been doing it. 256 people also, you've got to realise, is quite a big number in a little country where they've only been doing this 3 years. They've given one rejection in that time, and the person actually wanted to have a sort of X rather than an M or an F on their birth certificate. And the problem is, Ireland hadn't legislated for that, but they're now having a conversation about the potential for that. And then I'm going to talk about a place that's about the same size as Hong Kong Island itself, but with a fraction of the population. That's Malta. Malta, within a space of almost weeks, introduced same-sex marriage and gender recognition legislation. They've awarded new birth certificates to 80 people. I can't imagine, in the small population of Malta, how they've managed to find 80 people. They must have a very high rate of people being trans, almost as many as the people in, Thailand, actually, where the rate of being trans was so high in one research study. We sat and we were looking at it until somebody said, "How did you count all these trans people?" And they said, "Well, we stood outside the shopping mall," which huge shopping mall, fashion mall, and they said, and we counted all the people who looked like they were trans women as they passed us. Yeah, I think that's probably, given a little bit of a overemphasis there. But I'm still wondering where the 80 people came from. So anyway, let's look through these arguments. I think I need a beer. I'm sort of at 10 o'clock at night in my brain now. Is it contrary to nature? Is sex determined at birth? Well, we do know some really simple facts on this one. We know that about 1 in 200 babies are born sufficiently intersex for questions to be raised as to what sex they are. So that's 0.5%. We also know that of all the women who go to fertility clinics at the age of 30 to 33, that about 8% of them will have a form of mosaicism whereby their ovaries are streaked with testicular material. Now, actually, nobody turns around to those women and says, "You're not a real woman, and that's why you can't have a baby." What they say is, "You're not a real woman." They say, "Of course you're a woman, but unfortunately you can't have a baby, but we can help you through that." So we know that there are all sorts of other things. Lots of scientific data exists in the literature from the last 13 to 15 years, really, about brain sex and sex dimorphic nuclei being different in trans people, about the nature of white brain matter and that being cross-sexed in trans people. You only have to read The New Scientist to get any of this, incidentally. That's my science format, is every Friday morning The New Scientist comes and it's the weekend reading and I find out all sorts of things about all sorts of people. But there are also stuff on brain neuron pathways with new brain, new neuroscience of brains. They're able to tell the difference between what they call male and female brains, and trans people there are crossed. And recent research in the Czech Republic has even found a genetic marker for transsexual men. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I sort of, most of the time, rubbish this stuff and say it doesn't matter. We are all human. We are entitled to our human rights. The science is irrelevant. And then a little bit of me goes, and I might not pass the test if anybody tested me for any of these things. I don't know. I've no idea whether I'm a real transsexual person. Do any of us know whether we're real men or real women? I don't think so. And I think most people on reflection would say, well, I have a little bit of masculinity and femininity and this, and it all combines to make a very unique person in us. And certainly anybody who thinks about it, who reflects on the question, goes, well, you know, it's very hard to say for certain I know what being a woman is, or for certain what is being a man. So the data is out there, and, you know, go out there and answer the questions. This is the best one. Well, there is an argument that there really hasn't been sufficient change in social acceptance in Hong Kong. I've been coming here for 25 years. If anybody had told me 25 years ago that we could have had this report and this conference now, I'd have said, you'd be lucky to get 3 people there. You know, me and the 2 other trans people I know, because everybody else was hidden. We have known for years there has been a programme at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, but nobody would give you information. The data was hidden. It was a private matter, a private concern. And yet my dentist in England is a trans man from Hong Kong, you know, and came to Sheffield University, saw there was a trans men support network, made contact, and been the only person to keep my teeth in, thank God. But that social change, when he came to the UK, he came because his parents had told him that they had told his aunt and his uncle that he was dead. Right? And that was why he came to the UK. His aunt and uncle have just been in the UK on holiday with the family, going around, you know, in a minibus, going and seeing the Lake Districts and everything. That's the change that has happened in Hong Kong. He's been resurrected, truly, you know, Lazarus from the grave, because of the social changes and the conversations that have been had in Hong Kong. We see this international change. We even see countries which now provide a 3rd gender option. And I always say to people, you know, if you want to see how this can really work, go to Pakistan. Pakistan, about 5 years ago, after a lot of lobbying by women who, they're not hijra in Pakistan, it's a slightly different social construct, but people who we would probably recognise as trans women, lobbied the government because they said every time they went to vote in any election, they were harassed and not allowed to because the marker on their ID card didn't reflect their gender. So the government actually decided to allow them to be marked as 3rd gender on their identity cards. So it literally says 3rd gender. Thousands have taken advantage of that. And what's really interesting is they've not just voted, but you now see hundreds of them being local council representatives. There's 2 people in the National Parliament now. You have seen that huge, massive change in such a short space of time in an Islamic country with really strong traditional views on what are men and women. It is possible to make those changes. The 3rd argument was Hong Kong doesn't need a gender recognition law. Well, it's clear it needs something, because you can't just carry on ignoring the instructions of your equivalent of the Supreme Court. You know, and I believe the next case will be being heard in the new year and will almost certainly be won. I have no doubts about that. The argument about this is, well, we already provide people with passports, driving licences, ID cards, etc., as they go through life and as they go off and have surgeries and medical treatment and such like. But there are huge problems with that system. This is what we had in the UK for a very long time. And the problem was that what you were being given was by discretion. It wasn't a right to have your paperwork like that. It was a discretionary decision made by government officials. And there were always people who were left out of those decisions. You know, and just, I mean, I always say, I've only been unemployed once in my life. It lasted approximately 6 days, and the reason why it never went on any longer was I went to my local unemployment office all those years ago to sign the paperwork, and they shouted out, "Miss Stephen Whittle." Now, I tried to think at the time that nobody else would have heard, or they'd have thought it was a mistake because I had a beard and I looked like a bloke, surely, but I never went back to sign on. It's been a very, it's kept me working, and eventually led to a job which made me a professor one day. So they did me a great favour. But the problem with a system that we have at the moment is it always leaves out some people. Certainly anything that has medical or surgical requirements will exclude people with disabilities. And believe it or not, people with disabilities can be trans just as much as they can be men or women, you know, in their birth gender. But if you insist that they have certain procedures, you may well exclude them. Certainly you will exclude the elderly ill, you know. I have spoken to many older trans people who have eventually got to the point where they've been able to change their lives. It may be that a spouse has died or their children have grown up. Even they've retired, but they certainly can't go on an operating theatre table because they won't need a gender recognition certificate at the end of it because they won't be there any longer. All they'll need is a death certificate. So, you know, you'll exclude people. One of the most important elements of this is that you push people on this test goal process. In other words, you see it. I see, even in the UK now, where we don't have these requirements, I see kids going to clinics and they think they have to do it in a certain way in order to get the first stage of treatment. At 10-year-olds, I'll say, what do I have to do to get pubertal postponement treatment? And I say, you don't have to do anything. This is an opportunity for you to talk about yourself and your needs, but you don't have to do anything. Well, won't they expect me to dress in a certain way, to do something? Now, if you see that in 10-year-olds who are just trying to postpone puberty for a little bit, by the time you get to 18-year-olds who are desperately trying to transform their gender, you get this huge drive towards passing the tests, achieving the goals, passing the tests, achieving the goals, and nobody ever stopping to say, is this the right thing for me? Now, one of the problems that we have seen in the UK is because we've got people doing it younger, because we've got 16-year-olds having cross-sex hormones so that they can go to university in their new genders, at 21 they've been living in their new gender role for 3 years. So why shouldn't they go off and get a letter to go to the surgeon and have genital reconstruction surgery? There's no reason why they shouldn't, except most of them haven't had any form of steady sexual relationship at that point. So they haven't been able to think about how it really works, what might be missing if they have major surgery to remove this, to have it changed and altered. You know, it is a huge, huge change to the body, that sort of surgery. And we've had to do a lot of work in the UK with the younger members of the community to really educate themselves about making truly informed choices on surgery. So, it's important that surgery doesn't become coercive. And there's a remark that was made very recently in one of the British newspapers. Because, you know, surgery, any surgeon will say to you, it's as much an art as a science. And the results are variable according to the person you have on the table in front of you. So this is a person who, she's made a brilliant animation of actually what surgery should be with her surgeon. They've worked together on it. But she said afterwards she expected her vagina to look like Frankenpussy, as in Frankenstein, you know, after surgery. It was much worse than she could have ever imagined. Now, fortunately, it went on to recover well, and she's done well. But she said, we shouldn't be sending 18, 19 and 20-year-olds off to have that sort of surgery without real information, which is partly why she's made the animation with her surgeon. Okay, the fourth one is there may be unintended consequences. This really short part of it says, there's a little point where it says, well, if you give people new birth certificates and their old birth certificates put in sort of on the record, sitting in a little quiet place, somebody might go and take that record, that birth certificate out, and use it for fraudulent purposes, or worse, they may be a terrorist masquerading under that name of the person. Well, you know, I'm afraid terrorists have been doing this since the IRA did this in the early 70s, and they used to go around local graveyards and find children who died, preferably under the age of 10. So there were more than 4, but under 10, so there was sufficient paperwork to start to build a persona on. And they used to get a copy of the birth certificate and become that dead child. Now, if you could become a dead child, why would you bother hunting for the few trans people in the system who are much harder to find? You know, it already happens. And the second part of that is a person may want to change back. Well, yeah, there are a few people who have changed back over the years. They have transitioned, and then they've realised it's not made them any happier, and they've gone back. There have been even a few people who've had major surgery and then asked for it to be reversed, which is extremely difficult. I know of about 20, and I've been working with trans people all over the world now for 40 years. I know probably 100,000 trans people across that number, you know, some countries collected together, the people I've met at this events. 20 is a tiny, tiny number. What we do know, and the science is quite clear in long-term studies, is that the people who have regrets are getting fewer and fewer and fewer as surgical techniques improve. There is a huge difference from having surgery in 1960 and having surgery in 2017. Massive difference. And as countries have afforded gender recognition legislation and anti-discrimination protection, the regrets have got fewer and fewer. So we're now down to a figure of around 1.2% regret in Germany at the moment, where they still don't have very good gender recognition legislation. But certainly across Europe as a whole, we reckon it's less than 1% who have regrets. Now, by regrets, I'm not talking about people who want to transition back even. They've gone, you know, actually, I lost a lot. I could, you know, all of us, I think, could say, this was very hard. I lost things. I used to do sport. Look at me now. I used to be a sports player. I played cricket for Lancashire Ladies. And you look at me, a little short, fat man now who could, you know, couldn't run anything. Yeah, of course you lose things when you gain things. It's not easy. But the more we provide anti-discrimination legislation, the more we provide gender recognition, the less those regrets will be. Now, I can tell you, you know, I used to do sport, and look at me now. But if I talk to the group of young adults in the Netherlands who transitioned with support from clinical services when they were in their 10s, 11s, 12 years of age, had pubertal postponement treatment at 16, 17, got cross-gender hormone treatment. Many of them didn't have to have major surgery because they hadn't had the sort of development that comes with puberty. You know, they hadn't had to have facial hair removal because they'd never grown a beard. They hadn't had to have breast removal because they'd never grown breasts, because pubertal postponement had protected them from those things. And you talk to them now at 35, 36, 37. They recently had a sort of anniversary meeting of the clinic first opening, and they are young, successful adults. with families, with partners, with children, with jobs. Not one of them actually was unemployed, with university degrees, and actually with sport and all those things still available to them. They didn't need to have the regrets, because those things had made huge changes to protect them. Now I'm going to talk about one thing, one unintended consequence. The pregnant man, Thomas Beattie, gave birth to 3 children. He eventually did the newspaper stories because, as he said, the newspapers were going to write about me anyway. So we decided to tell them the truth and get enough money to finish the extension at the back of the house. But, you know, pretty common sense view on life in the end. Thomas Beattie says this: am I worried about the children being bullied because of me, because he'd been their birth parent? No. All children get bullied for being different. I was picked on for being mixed race. My father was Korean. But that doesn't mean I should never have been born. My wife is full of wisdom, and she says, you know, every child reaches 26 and looks back and goes, that was a really, she uses the word rum, meaning weird, that was a really weird way to bring up children. I'm not going to do it that way. She said we all reflect on how our parents brought us up and the things that happened. And think, oh God, we are not going to make those mistakes. And we work very hard not to make those mistakes, but I'm sure my children are saying exactly the same things now. No? We worried about whether our children were going to be bullied, and it was one of the questions that was repeatedly brought up to us because my wife was bearing our children, and we had fought for the right to have those children in the UK system. They were never bullied at school. In primary school, everybody knew, and we were just the neighbours. When they went to the secondary level school, where they met people from the wider part of the city, second day, they all run into the computer lab, somebody tapping each other's name, and somebody shouts across the laboratory, hey, Gabriel, is your dad a transsexual? And he goes, yeah, man, why? You know, simple as that. And he goes, oh, wow, that's really cool. And then 3 years later, you know, as these kids reached 14 or 15, I'd be sat up in my study working, and little knocks would come on the door. And I'd say, who's that? And they'd say, oh, it's just Josh, it's just Sean, it's just Jerry. And they'd walk in, I'd say, oh, how are you doing? They'd say, I'm fine, how are you, Stephen? I'd say, I'm good. They'd sit there for a bit and they'd say, I wonder whether I'm gay. And I became basically the school counsellor for years. So, all children have the potential for being bullied, whether it's that they've got wonky teeth or wonky parents. But, you know, doesn't mean to say they shouldn't have been born. The final argument made in Hong Kong is this is the slippery slope, undoubtedly, to same-sex marriage. And my answer to that is, well, guess what? It is the slippery slope. You know, no ifs, ands, but you've been on that slope for a very long time when I reflect on the changes that have taken place in Hong Kong. As social acceptance improves, the very fact that we're having the conversation means it's already happening. This is not a conversation had in a dark bar over in Kowloon and everybody says nothing actually to each other just in case we might actually accidentally say the wrong thing and somebody realises that person's trans. We don't do any of that. We're talking here now. We're talking, you know, I could say hello to Joanne, who I've met before, you know, and, oh, hi, how are you doing? And we've done bits and pieces together before, and nobody's going to look at us and think we're wrong to do that. It's changing. The thing that's really important about changing that awareness, and this is one of the most important responses to the consultation, is that the community here, the activists here, and the people who support them here have to bring to Hong Kong an awareness that relationships are about far more than sexual activities. that gender identity has very little relationship to sexual activity. And the only relationship it really has of any sort is that when you are going to sleep with somebody, you both stand in the bedroom and go, who does what to who? You know, because you're still a bit, you know, how do we do this? And both respect each other's sexual identities and such like. But actual relationships are about far more than sexual activities. And one of the most important things we did in the UK was we had 630 members of Parliament to persuade. Over a period of 5 years, we got members of the trans community to write to their constituency MP until we had recorded that every constituency MP had been written to at least once by a trans person. We had all 635 under our belt. And then we said, go and see them in their constituency surgery on a Saturday morning and show them that you're real. You know, actually talk about the realities, the things that are important to you. And gradually we got that. And it's really interesting because we also said to people, why not offer, when there's an election coming up or something else, volunteer to be somebody in the office, helping out. When I look at political party level politics in the UK, we're everywhere. In every party, mostly on the left, but there's actually still some on the right. We are just in every conference, at every event. You'll see trans people actively engaged and working as a consequence of that. And that made a massive difference because members of Parliament had met us as real people. And if you, as the trans community here, if the trans community in Hong Kong really want to win this battle, you have to get out there and be real people. Really important. You will also, as part of the slippery slope, see this increase in non-gender binary identities. And I'm going to say that quickly because when you look at people who have non-gender binary identities, they're just like the rest of trans people. They sort of live in one role, then they move to another role, and everybody knows them as she or he. The fact they have a non-gender binary identity is irrelevant in reality. We've had this big group lobbying for changes in our Equality Act because they say it doesn't really cover us. And I say, yeah, we'll change the wording because that slight change in wording and you will get covered. So you do get these new identities appear in the trans world, but you know, if gender isn't just binary, if it's far more than that, it doesn't matter if there's more new gender identities. So I'm going to go on to the very final argument that I've got. Law and the reasonable citizen. John Rawls, and this is first year jurisprudence, so most of you have done it. People can make arguments from the Bible if they want to, but I want them to see that they should also give arguments that all reasonable citizens might agree to. John Rawls is probably the modern philosopher of law. And there is no truism better when you're being an activist than this one. You can talk about the Bible, I don't have a problem with that, but make it one that all reasonable citizens. John Rawls basically says the rule of law requires reasonable citizens to want to live in society in which they can cooperate with their fellow citizens on terms that are acceptable to all. And one of the things the trans community and the LGB community who support them need to do is point out to the rest of Hong Kong society that you are all reasonable citizens together and be part of it. And I'm going to finish through that and just show you this one picture. Eastbourne is a small, semi-rural town on the south coast of England. It is a nothing place. Nothing ever happens in Eastbourne except just down the coast the Battle of Hastings happened, but that wasn't in Eastbourne anyway. This is a picture of the local trans support group presenting a cheque to their Member of Parliament for a children's charity, money that they have raised for that charity. The small guy in the front who's presenting the cheque is a trans man and he's a police officer. And he stood there in his police uniform. And then you've got all these trans women at the background. They took part in a seafront underwear walk amongst other Eastbourne citizens to raise this money for a children's hospice and got to present the cheque. That, to me, is what gender recognition law is all about. It will be of immense benefit to the few. There is minimal risk of harm to the many, and society will be far better balanced with fewer outlaws. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We did get started a bit late, but I will allow a bit of time for a couple of questions, if that's all right with Stephen.
Okay.
Does anybody have a quick question?
I obviously told you everything you need to know.
Michael? Wait for the mic, please.
Testing.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Very informative. I sort of flew into Hong Kong just a couple of days ago, so I heard about this. I'm not much prepared in terms of the law and the topic, but I'm curious, if you don't impose surgery on people, as has been discussed here, what kind of regulation or controls or support do you think are important for voluntary surgery for people? Because I have a nephew who's come out as trans, and within a few months he's talking about getting surgery. I was sort of inclined to say, no.
Calm him down, for God's sake.
That's what I told him. I said, wait until you have some support for what you want to do. And I'd like to hear what you want to say about this, because it could be very relevant in Hong Kong if a more moderate approach is taken with the law.
One of the things that I think is beneficial to having a no-surgery approach to the law is it removes the goal orientation of having surgery to get gender recognition. I think that's really important. Secondly, when we did the law in the UK, this was the first law to do, no surgical requirements. We actually did research with the passport office and the driving licence office to see if anybody had had a change of driving licence or passport, and then later asked for it to be changed back. And there were a handful of people, but all of them had done it in under 2 years. So at that time, we imposed a 2-year requirement on people having to have lived in their gender role. Now, as I say, we're looking at this again, and we think that could be significantly reduced from the latest figures that we've been doing. As I say, regrets have got less as people have got better educated and are able to do it in a better way than was done in the past. And we're talking about reducing it to a period of between 3 and 6 months in which the person would have had counselling of some sort, and that would have had to be documented. But that being the primary, the wheels keep taking me backwards, but that being the primary requirement, really very much following the Irish model, but having a little stopgap in between. Interestingly, the most opposition to that idea has come from people who already have gender recognition certificates. And it's, as I call it, the old lags, people like me who go, if it was going to be that easy, why did you make it so hard for us? And there was a little bit of me that felt that too. But then I thought, it is 25 years since we started this campaign. The world changes, I'm no longer a young man. I no longer have the vigour I used to have, and perhaps, now is the time to give way to new ideas. But I do think that what I am very wary of is this idea that if you give somebody a new birth certificate or a new identity card of some sort, that it gives them an absolute right to surgery. They say, hey, I'm legally a man. You wouldn't say to any man without a penis that he had to go and wait 5 years to have that surgery. No, you wouldn't. But guess what? You're in a different situation. You've got a fully functioning set of genitals. You need to decide the risks and balances of this surgery. When we're dealing with biological men who've had an accident in the playground when they were kids, or they've had it chopped off in a car crash, we're talking about emergency surgery at that point. You're doing elective surgery, and so you should take more time to think about it. But I think that's a really important thing to present. It's an idea.
This one is
Okay, with time for one more question. Azan?
the one I don't have that on USB.
Thank you very much for such a fascinating presentation. One thing which you almost didn't mention, you mentioned it very briefly, and my biggest problem with the consultation paper released by the Interdepartmental Working Group is there's pretty much no mention of intersex people and the particular issues that they might have. Now, I'm not intersex, so it's difficult for me to imagine it, but as someone coming from civil society and being concerned about the decisions that might be made by the IWG, it does seem to me like this is an issue that needs particular special consideration.
Certainly, I absolutely agree. I think we made a huge mistake when we did the Gender Recognition Act originally not to include some of the issues around people who were intersex wanting to change their birth certificates when they were adults. In fact, the legislation actually excluded them. And I don't know why we made the mistake. It was almost like we were all doing it so quick under so much pressure that this question of people who were being intersex. But the other thing, there was one thing that did happen. We had a huge lobby from the intersex groups that are run by parents of children born with intersex conditions who said, we don't want our children to be linked with the trans community at all. Obviously, they found us an embarrassment and they didn't want their children to have to carry that burden. It was parental groups. But of course, what you then get is there's always been within the trans community a small number of trans people who have an intersex condition. Some of whom have changed, they were brought up in one gender and they've now changed to the one they're more comfortable with. And the problem is the legislation excluded them, technically. Now, in reality, I know that the Gender Recognition Panel has said, don't show us and we won't comment on it. But that was a policy decision that was made that was, spread around by word of rumour more than anything else, because we couldn't formalise that. And it's certainly something that in terms of the new legislation, we want to ensure that if people can change their birth certificates, that is technically a right accessible to anybody who changes the gender that they live in. But we will have hard lobbying from parental groups.
Yeah, if I could just very briefly, in Hong Kong, I've heard it raised several times by intersex groups that there's a rush to surgery on children born intersex, which might lead to the problem you were just addressing.
I think, I'm not sure if that actually exists any longer. And I'm saying that because having talked over the years to many conferences and training events for doctors who provide this urological surgery and technically were the doctors in the past doing surgery on infants, they really don't tend to do it now. Because, there is an acknowledged recognition that it isn't good enough to protect nerve function, sexual orgasmic ability of the child when they grow up into being an adult. And so it is something that preferably you should be talking with the parents and finding a way to ensure that that is something the child considers themselves at a later stage. I don't know of a surgeon who's done that sort of surgery for probably 10 years. And so I think there is still very much a sensation, because we have adults now who had often experienced that themselves, that they haven't sort of thought, well, what is actually happening now, and gone out and found the information. And I think there's a desperate need for those groups to actually go out now and talk to doctors and find out what is the current position here in Hong Kong.
Okay. Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, unfortunately, we can't take any more questions now, but Stephen will be providing commentary on the presentations in the next panel, and I think there will be a lot of other opportunities to discuss throughout the day. And my colleagues have been very efficient, and everybody's come up to the panel, and I think the PowerPoints are being set up, so we should be able to move on pretty quickly to the next panel. Okay. So let me just make sure that it's all right. We don't have any technical problems. Again, in the interests of catching up with the time a little bit, I'm going to forego the proper introductions of if that's all right with the three distinguished panelists, but their full bios are in the program also, so please do have a look, and you can get a sense of their impressive backgrounds and experience in this area. So the first speaker, and I'm also going to ask my colleagues to limit themselves please to 15 minutes. So that we can catch up, again, to catch up with the time. And I'm already talking too much. So the first speaker is Peter Redding from the Equal Opportunities Commission. If your PowerPoint is ready. Is that it? Okay, great.
Sure, it's okay. Yeah, you can. So you want to move, or there is a microphone. Maybe I'll put that on. Yeah, sure. Now it's on. You can just clip somewhere here. Right. Yeah. Maybe just to turn it on. That's better. That's better.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Yes? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, it's been a pleasure to be able to collaborate with Hong Kong U on this issue. The EOC, we've been doing a lot of work on LGBT rights in the last few years, as you may know. And in relation to gender identity, we've been calling for anti-discrimination legislation, but we've also been working on this issue of gender recognition laws. So I want to focus now on the situation in Hong Kong. Stephen's obviously talked about the situation overseas and, for example, in the UK. So what is the situation here? And want to go through the public consultation just briefly to give you an idea of what it covers. And then also, how does that relate to the international human rights obligations and the case law on these issues? Because I think that's very, very important to understand these issues. So as you may know or may not know, currently there is no legal obligation to recognize people's right to self-determination in terms of gender identity. Although people can change their ID if they do have full sex reassignment surgery, there's no obligation on the government to legally recognize that change in identity. And that's actually stated by the government in the consultation document. So that's obviously a major problem and contrasts with the situation in many countries now which do have formal recognition. The other major problem with the situation in Hong Kong is that there is a requirement to have surgery which results in sterilization of people, and we'll come on to why that is a clear breach of people's human rights if they do not wish to have such surgery. the situation in Hong Kong, the person to my left, has done a lot of work on these issues. He's going to talk to you more about the case law, but the only situation in which there's been legal recognition of transgender people's rights is the right to marry because of the case of W that Michael took. But they also recommended that there should be the introduction of comprehensive gender recognition legislation, which is why it was so important. And he will talk to you more about that. As I said, we at the EOC have done a lot of work on these issues, not just in relation to gender recognition laws, but we see this as part of a package. You can't just have gender recognition laws, you also need to have anti-discrimination laws. So with the Chinese University, Tung, who's going to be talking a little bit later, we did a comprehensive study on introducing anti-discrimination laws because at the moment we don't have that in Hong Kong. We have anti-discrimination laws that cover sex, disability, race, and family status. So that study we published last year in January, and the most important aspect of it is the fact that we found that there is widespread discrimination against transgender people in all aspects of public life, whether it's employment, services, the government services and premises and so on. So what we recommended was that the government start consultation on this issue and introduce anti-discrimination laws. But unfortunately, the government hasn't reacted to that, has not started any public consultation, and has not introduced such anti-discrimination laws. And these are also things that the UN has recommended. So repeatedly, they've called for such legislation in Hong Kong. The consultation actually expressly states that it doesn't cover the issue of anti-discrimination laws, which is obviously understandable in the sense that it's a different set of legislation, but it's extremely important that such laws are also introduced. So if you turn to the public consultation, the Interdepartmental group was established after the W case because it recommended that there should be comprehensive legislation. So although it was established in January 2014, the consultation only started a couple of months ago, well, in June. And it runs until October, so you have time to send a submission. And
my current favourite clients. Now, I'm limited to a certain degree by anonymity orders that apply, my client confidentiality, and the fact that there is litigation afoot. But in generality, perhaps I can just take you through collectively sort of what they represent. They are all preoperative trans men. They all have Hong Kong permanent residence, all born and bred in Hong Kong, all been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, all elected to have hormone treatment and top surgery. They've all got, in some shape or form, passports from abroad, two full UK passports, and one with a BNO passport. Each surgery they don't want to undergo, and therefore leaves them in a situation where they are presenting in all material respects, apart from the fact that they don't have some form of a penis. They are male. And yet, they have an ID card which marks their gender as female. So this presents problems at, banks. We all know the example of bank tellers who, they're not exactly quiet when discussing some of your issues, and you've got a queue of people behind you. Here they are, flustering over, the fact that there's an ID card saying the word F on your ID card. Oh, is this your ID card? Should I call you madam? you know, you've got a guy there in front of that person. You know, this is to the extent where the litigants weren't taking out telephone contracts because they didn't want to go through the process in a telephone shop of a shop assistant, you know, agonizing over the issue about their ID card. They, you know, got to the stage of not going into residents of friends' houses where those residences required giving identity documents. In one of their cases, they're actually stopped by the police. They certainly don't look suspicious. It was just a normal ID card stop. But you know, this is the circumstance which they were you know, embarrassed, humiliated, questioned about their gender. We've got here someone here also who suffered the same sort of indignity, having come out of a toilet in the IFC. So, very quickly, I've been told to get a move on. So collectively, what's the basis or why they decided to challenge the current policy requiring SRS? Well, look, they're all satisfied with their external appearance. They are externally indistinguishable from any other man. They are medically and psychiatrically, there is no need for surgery, stress. There is significant health risks involved in removal of uterus and ovaries. You know, it's major intrusive surgery. It's, you know, it is major surgery to undergo constructive surgery. And they don't want to do that. And they don't want to do that, if nothing else, not only the health risks, but because the state of surgery at the moment, especially in Hong Kong, the provisions available in Hong Kong is so primitive. Referenced here to, I'm going to get it wrong, meteoroidoplasty. In essence, it's a creation of a flap. It satisfies the policy of some form of penis, but you know, in no shape or form would it pass the test of really forming a realistic penis. And yet, you know, that is the surgery that really is available here in Hong Kong, because the skill sets of the surgeons in Hong Kong are so limited. So the basis for the judicial review, very quickly again, interference with the right to privacy. This was, if you remember, it wasn't argued in, or we argued it, but it wasn't considered by the court in the W case. CIDT, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Article 3 of the Bill of Rights. This is related to a case that Patsy did, the Ubmarker case, to do with refugees and claimants. I mean, this is a right that cannot be limited. This is an absolute right. And so, you know, we say that the coercive element of requiring this surgery in order to gain the right to recognition offends against this Article 3. We also tacked into Q's case right to equal treatment under Article 22 of Borrow, and also an indirect discrimination aspect to the case. That relates to the fact that there's a requirement that applies to both trans men and trans women to undergo this surgery. It's indirect discrimination in that it is in fact unequal because it's not equal requirement for both men and women. The requirement for trans men is that much more difficult. Surgery for a trans man is that much more difficult than surgery for a trans woman. So we'll see how that's dealt with. So before I conclude, if I can just quickly say, just as an indication of this is the way the government thinks, right? The first affirmation that we got for them, the very first point that they thought was important that we read, was, and this is the need for there to be surgery for clarity, this bright line, was in case of chemical warfare attack on Hong Kong, there would be a need, and people be there would be a problem identifying which queue of showers trans people would have to join, presumably when their skin is peeling off, and you know, that they are dying of some horrible poison. Anyway, that's just an indication of our Hong Kong government for you. We can talk about strategy in the open session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for giving us a synopsis of what's happening, where we are in Hong Kong now, and the cases that have led us to this point, as well as the recent challenges. Sure. Okay.
Okay. Hi. Thanks. So, quickly, I think I just want to emphasize something that's already been touched on. So, what our firm has been dealing with in the last couple of years is the issue of the breach of fundamental rights of transgender persons in custody in particular. Now, we, you know, in dealing with this community, what's really interesting is that we're dealing with an already very vulnerable population, vulnerable in that they are incarcerated, and vulnerable in that they are transgender and not given the right recognition in Hong Kong. And essentially, the treatment that they are served with amounts to CIDTP. So, I mean, I just wanted to share in particular this one case we've been bringing. It's mentioned by Michael earlier, the case of Luigi. Now, this is a lady who came to Hong Kong and breached laws and was sentenced to imprisonment. Now, there's no argument about this sentence. You know, she did commit a crime, so she was in custody. However, what we saw with the treatment was just astonishing. Luigi's a woman who was taking hormone pills since she was about 11 years old. And in fact, this is a very common practice across Asia, you know, despite the relatively undeveloped legal situation. It's very common for people across Asia to start taking hormone pills from young. So when she came to Hong Kong, she's very young, around 19 years old. She didn't even have an Adam's apple. She didn't go through puberty. She looked like a stunning young woman. What happened then was just the most horrific experience that she could ever imagine. She was taken into male custody. She was strip searched multiple times, and in fact, you know, that's a whole separate issue of how common strip search is used as a tactic to intimidate prisoners in Hong Kong, and just as a standard procedure whenever people get into and out of detention. So she was strip searched by male officers dozens of times. She was basically asked to use male toilets. So to the extent where whenever she goes into shower, she would have rows of men standing outside the shower room because they're told to stand outside, but they would look through the doors and basically direct her to turn, ask her to do this, ask her to do that. And it was just incredibly humiliating for her. Throughout a period of over a year, she's been sexually harassed multiple times. Lots of men have been asking her for favors so that they would give her cigarettes. She basically even got into the habit of going, well, I might as well benefit with some cigarettes. She developed severe mental issues in detention, and had some experts here help with diagnosing her. She, you know, because she actually didn't go through surgery, and she didn't go through puberty as well. So when she was in detention, she was at a stage where she was still dependent on hormones, but she was asked to stop her hormone treatment. So she started freaking out because all of the efforts she's put into keeping her appearance was basically slowly coming apart. She was slowly developing her Adam's apple. She was slowly growing hairs. Her skin was breaking out. She had so much acne. She had pains all over her body. It was just ridiculous. And so there was a series of, correspondence with the government, because this just didn't make sense. Let's just deal with it normally. She's suffering right now. Can you just at least let her have her hormones if you're not going to move her yet? No, because this is not a procedure that we would allow. So anyways, it's pretty obvious why we would take this case to court, and a lot of the grounds is very similar to what Michael's already presented with the other case. But I think maybe, cutting my presentation very short, one of the main point here is that, there's another angle to look at this whole conversation, which is that the denial of rights, the denial of the recognition can lead to some ridiculous situations. There is a right way to do this. What we're seeing right now after this Luigi case is that the government is dealing with it with an even more harsher method. In light of the fact that we've taken the Luigi case to court, instead of improving the treatment of transgender persons in custody, they've now decided that the only way they can deal with it is to make this happen, yes, and to put them all in isolation. They are now generally placed in complete isolation, so that they are not in touch with either the male community or the female community. They have no way of interacting and having activities during the day. We've been seeing people lately whose psychological conditions are worsening in such drastic ways that I think with my slight mental health training, but I'm not an expert, I'm basically looking at a person develop psychosis. They're thinking of all ways they can to think of committing suicide. They're even losing contact with the outside world because they can't bring themselves to express their frustrations and anguish in custody to their support network outside, whether it's NGOs or families. So the situation is just ridiculous. So yeah, I think that's basically the piece I want to contribute to this conversation so far, and we'll let the other issues be discussed in other sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Patsy, and thank you for pointing out these other issues and the fact that the lack of gender recognition can lead to situations that create a number of possibilities for violations of other rights. I'd like to invite Stephen, would you like to speak from there? We could bring a mic, or would you like to come up here? Either way. To just provide a few comments on the Hong Kong cases that we've just heard about.
Do you want me to comment?
Sure.
I have to say, I have to thank all three of you for absolutely brilliant presentations, because I have spent the last 2-3 days having 3 hours sleep a night, and I went over there deliberately, so if I fell asleep, nobody could see me. And I've been wide awake completely. I have to say, I thought, Peter, you summed up really well the issues in terms of international human rights. But of course, Michael and Patsy have talked about real life cases with real life people. We also have faced the problems of imprisonment in the UK. When I was first dealing with people who were incarcerated, that is over 25 years ago, they were all placed in solitary. We saw exactly the same sorts of things happen. It has been a very long and slow process to get current new guidelines. I would say a total of 20 years to get the present guidelines and 13 years to get the first guidelines. But we shouldn't have to be doing it that long at all any longer, because other countries have been through the process of creating guidelines and creating ways of doing it differently. I was horrified on reading about the Luigi case, but it doesn't surprise me, because in all the years that I've, known Hong Kong and seen people being imprisoned, I've been seeing this repeatedly as their experience. But I am really shocked by the fact that the government's current response is to place everybody in solitary confinement, which is double punishment, just by the very nature of being placed in solitary. So, if there's anything we can do to help.
Actually, if you don't mind me adding an extra point, just because of all the people showing interest here, the judgment for the Luigi case should come out by the end of October. So certainly looking forward to that. And if you don't mind, just wanted to mention one more quick point, which is another very troubling issue about the detention situation is that post-op detainees are not allowed to bring dilators in. Well, sorry, I should say they were not allowed to bring dilators into detention. So those of you who are familiar with the process would know that after surgery, you have to use the dilator for several hours a day initially, and then it could decrease. And if you don't do that, there's very serious repercussions, serious surgeries to follow up may be possible. So, this is something that's good, which is after we raised all these issues in the Luigi case, they have since allowed transgender persons to bring in these utensils, but still only if you scream and kick, and probably have an NGO or lawyer involved to make that happen.
Okay, thank you. Well, now we have plenty of time for questions and comments. So I'll open it up to the audience.
I'll go first. Good morning. It's great to hear from the experts on the panel. It's a very quick comment because all the panelists have highlighted is how quickly things are, or at least the law is developing in this area of law. And one of the key drivers to change in the European Court of Human Rights was that even in the 80s, when the European Court of Human Rights were not, they were dismissing cases, they still at that time laid down an obligation for the court to keep this area of law under review, so that even though the cases were decided before, they still are willing to hear the same cases. And until the breakthrough came in the mid-90s, and then obviously in 2002, and they again used that, relied on that obligation to keep this area of law under review, and that was very key in the Garçon Nico case, which about sterilization requirements. So this was very important, and also that obligation is able to keep alive the conversations that are ignited by the cases. And I wonder how in this consultation we can really, whatever criteria we are submitting right now, it's very important that all camps are willing to express to the consultation, to the IWG, that there needs to be an obligation to keep this area of law under review. The best would be some kind of a statutory obligation. And I think this would probably be the best outcome we can have from this IWG and under the current political situation. And it's a comment, so there's no question.
Thank you. Anybody else down here?
Question for Patricia. I'm not sure whether I catch it right or wrong. In that case, did the lady go through appeal on sentence? Is that why the judgment is expected at the end of October? Is it?
I know. So the criminal case, there was no appeal in that, and that's been dealt with. The case that's ongoing is the judicial review, which is challenging the conditions of the detention. So there are multiple areas that's under challenge, including whether it was appropriate for officers to strip search her, whether it was proper to place her in a male facility, whether it was proper for them to place her in isolation at different points, and a series of different complaints throughout the time, and also the denial of hormone treatment. So basically, the court's to decide upon whether the present policies relating to the detention of transgender persons. That's basically run by CSD, as well as the strip search policies by the police, whether that's lawful or not.
So is she still serving imprisonment? Or,
No,
no,
she's left now. And I should, she's in the Philippines now. She's been released.
All right.
Yeah,
So,
but she's still following up with the case just because of the fact that the case was taken while she was in custody, but because judicial reviews tend to take a very long period of time. So, I mean, the hearing actually took place a long time ago, but we're looking at the judgment coming out.
thank you. Yeah. But just now you say she's not in Hong Kong now. That brings me to another issue. We remember the case of Ariana, who has been, well, it's not anything about gender recognition, but Ariana was the domestic helper who has been violently abused, physically abused by the employer. And she left Hong Kong, but she lodged subsequent claim when she was outside. In this case, I'm not sure whether it has been thought of that perhaps it also depends on the result of the JR, but whether it might be thinkable that she could lodge a criminal complaint against any of the officers for sexual abuse, indecent assault, or that kind of thing, or whether that could be thinkable or not.
Definitely thinkable. In fact, there are ongoing police investigations into this. However, it's not going well. Mainly not because of I can't blame the authorities on this. Just mainly because the client at the moment just wants to have a new life. She's in the Philippines. She doesn't even want to go through the hell of going through all these stories and experiences all over again. And so yeah, I mean, for herself, she just doesn't want to pursue this. But yeah, thanks for that.
Can I make a comment? Please. I think I'd just like to make a comment there, and that one of the things that we have seen in the UK is that as we gradually obtained rights with the gender recognition law, with first of all employment protection, then gender recognition, then goods and services protection, and finally full anti-discrimination protection under the Equality Act, and through the activism that came to create those changes, we have also seen a significant change in the community. And what we have now is a community of people who wish to enforce their rights. So they don't take it lying down in the same way as used to happen. A lot of the times we took it and we, walked away from it and just thought it's over. But now people actually say we want to enforce our rights. And I think that's been a really important and significant aspect to the development of a recognition of rights.
Can I just add that? I mean, the same with lesbian and gay rights. When we brought the Billy Learn case, at that stage there hadn't been a single LGBTI case really in Hong Kong, and with that case, people felt able to come out, frankly, to their families. I mean, Billy came out to his family during the case, but after that, lots of young gay men and women felt able to discuss, and there was far more acceptance. So now there's far more open and accepting discussion about lesbian and gay rights. The same applied with W and transgender rights. Before there was no discussion. There was just, talking about the monster people, in Chinese. There was nothing. But because the way that the Hong Kong journalists tend to latch onto cases to report, because it's easy reporting, there was a fair amount of reporting of the case, and because there was, a strident reactionary presence here in Hong Kong, that made sure that the debate continued. So, but with that, people then felt more able to discuss and come out, and same with the Q, R, and Henry's A case. Once we launched Q, R and Henry came forward. Once it was sort of known that this case was going forward. So it enables people, it empowers people to be able to come forward. They see that these cases can be brought. They can see that they can have anonymity if they want to, or not, as the case may be. And they can realise that there's no going to be a lightning bolt is going to strike them down. That they're not going to be suddenly lose their jobs or anything like that. They can continue on leading their lives and litigate.
I have a question for all of the panelists. Picking up on the suggestion or the comment about keeping this area of law under review or having a statutory requirement to continue to review the law, as I think it was probably based on pragmatism. And I'm wondering, in the current climate, what do you think is sort of the best probable outcome of the consultation, and what sort of model do you think is actually realistic? But also, the second part of the question is, what kind of strategy would you recommend going forward, not just in this consultation period, but beyond, through the courts or otherwise?
Well, this is a really good point, because there's the ideal and then there's reality. And I think obviously the ideal is to have a model that is self-determination, and that it's like something like Ireland, Argentina, and so on. But I think as what you're alluding to, Kelley, is the reality is in Hong Kong we have a LegCo which it's very hard to pass any legislation, but it will be even harder to pass some sort of comprehensive gender recognition laws. So we've been having meetings on this at the EOC with stakeholders, and actually we were talking about it just in the last meeting with Azan, who's here, who's a barrister. So one option could be that you have a model where you have primary legislation with an ordinance, but that states that the government will introduce regulations on these issues, which do not necessarily need to go through LegCo in order to be approved. And that could be a way to try and hopefully get these laws passed, but without the whole problems that you face with LegCo. And that has been done in the cases of other legislation in Hong Kong, and it's done in the UK, where you've got primary legislation, but then regulations that where all the detail is of what is required. So that is something that perhaps the government could consider as a practical means of trying to get this passed, because we have to be realistic that. Well, obviously, we can understand these issues, but I think a lot of LegCo members won't. And so we already had, with the, as Michael mentioned, with the Marriage Amendment Bill, even that, which was the minimum, couldn't be passed. So if we want to try and pass some sort of comprehensive gender recognition ordinance, I think it's going to be obviously even harder. So that's one option that we've been talking about.
I'd be interested to see. I'm assuming that we're going to be taking QR and Henry Day up to the Court of Final Appeal in the end. The state of our courts as it stands at the moment. I would fully expect that. But it'd be interesting to see whether the Court of Final Appeal will take the same sort of approach it took with W. Given the fact that the Hong Kong government singularly failed to do as the court expected, whether the court would be perhaps more strident in its approach. Courts generally don't like to set down issues like this. It's they run a mile. They say, "Oh, we'll talk about the constitution. We'll talk about the law. You talk about how to put it into effect." But there are instances around the world where there are sort of mechanisms in place where there's sort of provisions to encourage the government to do that. Judge Bakari, Mr. Justice Bakari, mentioned an interesting case that came out of South Africa, I think it was the other day, a land rights case where there was basically a a fine imposed for every sort of day that the government didn't. It was to do with people's rights to occupy land. And they said, well, you can continue to occupy that land, but the government has to compensate the owner of the land per day for the time it takes them to resettle these people. I thought, what a nice idea if we could have some sort of provision where we could have the government somehow, or the court imposing some sort of financial penalty for every day that it failed to introduce legislation, and see how quickly the government introduced that legislation.
Yeah, I mean, for me on my part, I'm just looking at minimum thresholds a lot of time. Looking at the situations on a day-to-day basis, you're getting, well, I mean, not every day, but it does happen perhaps once a month, where there's immense pressures with the frontline officers dealing with, here's a transgender person, what on earth am I going to do? I'd like to do it properly, but my guidelines tell me that I cannot. So on a very urgent basis, these issues have to be sorted out. So, you know, from my perspective, it could just be, like, part of it could be presented that way, is you need some sort of minimal protection right now, and there can't be delay. So if it needs to be sort of dealing with sort of this whole issue from different approaches, I would say so be it. I don't know if this is controversial or not.
It's called policy. I mean, Kevin Zervos, he was the DPP at the time. He plonked into the prosecution policy guidelines, it's called the Palermo Protocol, which introduced into the concept of what human trafficking was. He introduced that by just a decision. He was the DPP. He decided he was going to introduce that as a policy decision. And that meant from then on, prosecutors had to consider the Palermo Protocol when deciding whether to prosecute someone. So similarly, the police can institute policy guidelines, so can the CSD. They're not confined. They don't have to wait for specific legislation to do this. I mean, Peter and I, we gave a talk just after the W case, 5 years ago, I think it was, to the Police Superintendent's Promotion Board. And we were telling them about this issue, about what to do in relation to the case that Patsy's mentioned. You know, and it's just a matter of the police instituting a policy, and I believe the UK police introduced a policy to deal with this before the Gender Recognition Act was actually instituted.
Many years before.
To take account of, you know, what do you do in these instances. And in essence, in the UK, it was, well, okay, you'll be searched by the person of the gender of your choice. That's, ostensibly, that was the decision that was made, as I recall. But they had, you know, so the CSD could do exactly the same. It's not rocket science. It doesn't need legislative change. It just needs common sense and application and political will.
I have to say, the number of times I've said this is down to common sense and respect. And one of the things that we campaigned on was respect and equality for all trans people. And they all used to be in capital letters, so that we were really emphasising that this was, you can't pick us out and say that those people can be treated better than those people. One of the models I think that Hong Kong activists, community members and supporters could look at is the model of what took place in Ireland. Now, in Ireland, for 30 years, they had an individual, Lydia Foy, who worked as a dentist, taking her personal case against the Irish government and winning repeatedly, and the Irish government failing to do absolutely anything about it. And part of the problem was the only person anybody knew who was trans in Ireland was Lydia Foy. It was like nobody else existed. But of course they did exist, and eventually a small group did decide that they needed to do something in the, well, it wasn't until about 2006 that there were 9 of them, and they formed a group called Transgender Era, TENI, and they really worked hard as a small group of people to get people to participate in the conversation, to also look at how other countries had done the various aspects. So a lot of looking at what we'd done here, visiting the Netherlands. We created it somewhere in the middle of this Transgender Europe, so we had a much more networked way of talking about these things across Europe. So, for example, when we were first looking at the possibilities of the legal conditions of access to healthcare in Europe, we realised that Poland didn't have a word for transgender or transsexual, and we had to make it up. And actually, our Polish au pair made up the word that is now used in Poland. So, you know, all of these things can happen entirely. Policy can be developed on the hoof. You can move towards legislation gradually. We have this primary legislation, but we have regulations alongside it. We have policy in relation to prisons. Because we were doing the prison policy, I said, if we're going to do the prison policy, can we also write the detention policy for people in asylum detention, for example? And they went, ooh, okay, you know, we did that alongside. But a lot of this, you see Tenny in Ireland, which, as I say, was a tremendously Roman Catholic country and still is in many ways, where I think one of the most important things that any activist group can do is really decide to put their heads above the parapet. You don't have to be on public television. You don't even have to do the radio, but you do have to talk to your local legislator. You do have to engage with local voluntary bodies that do education about all sorts of things. You do have to even put yourself forward to the local church and say, can I talk to your ladies group on Thursday night about these issues? And be there, you know, making yourself the professional speaker for those things. You're not going to get paid for it. You're going to do it all for free. But it will actually, and I think the number of trans people in the UK who've come forward to me and over the years and have said, this campaign made such a difference to my life. It made me decide to go back to school. It made me decide to change my career. And one of the best examples is actually a very good friend of mine, Annie. When we started the Press for Change campaign in 1990, we decided to ask for local volunteers who like to drink to go. We wanted small groups who would literally go to the bars where the script writers for the 4 biggest soap operas in the UK came after their script meetings. So we did the homework. We found out that when they had their weekly script meetings, which bars they went to, and we had a small group of volunteers who went and sat in the bars, and Annie was one of those. And eventually the writers of Coronation Street, the biggest soap, who'd got to know these trans women in the bars over a period of years, said, hey, we're thinking of doing one of you in our stories. We had Hayley Cropper, a character. She was in for years, 12 years in the soap, until she died from cancer, nothing else. She got an ordinary illness, you know, and died. But we had, the day she was unable to get married, our government announced its interdepartmental working group, because they had thousands of letters from ordinary people talking about the fact that Hayley Cropper on Coronation Street, who wasn't even real, couldn't get married. Yeah, so there are little things like that. Now, Annie was, at the time, she got engaged in local amateur dramatics, partly because of this. She was interested, and she started to do some of this. And I persuaded her to go to college to do drama, and she is now on the 4th biggest soap in the UK. She has a 5-year contract. She's playing the headmistress of a school who has been outed as a transsexual woman. And I said, do you mind that? And she said, why should I mind it? It's a really good job. I get really well paid. And I've got other acting jobs being offered now as a consequence. So, you know, overall, I think the whole point of this is that for me, for trans people, is trans people have to stop thinking of themselves as victims and start to think of themselves as citizens and demanding their rights as citizens to participate, because that will make the biggest changes of all.
On that note, in that call for engagement and participation, please join me in thanking our panelists and our keynote speaker for this excellent session.